When you hear the word feast, you probably think of a massive table covered in food, like a Thanksgiving dinner or a holiday celebration. That is the image most people bring to the feasts of Israel mentioned in the Bible, a series of ancient dinner parties. But the Hebrew text in Leviticus uses a different term, moed. This word translates to appointment. It describes a scheduled meeting or a specific date on a calendar set by a higher authority where you are expected to show up. This linguistic shift changes the nature of these 7 days. They function as a master schedule for human history, tracking major events before they happen. This schedule was established during the Exodus. For 400 years, the Israelites were slaves in Egypt, witnessing 10 plagues that were actually targeted strikes against Egyptian gods. For example, 3 days of total darkness challenged the power of Ra, the sun god, proving the Egyptian theological system was powerless. On the night of the final plague, God did something he had never done before. He reset the calendar. He told Moses that this specific month would now be the beginning of months, measuring all of Israel's future time from the moment they were set free. The layout of this new year was highly structured. It was built on the foundation of the weekly Sabbath, with 7 appointments placed in an exact symmetry, 3 in the spring, 1 in the summer, and 3 in the fall. By setting these specific dates, God established a series of deadlines. He circled these moments on the timeline and promised to arrive for every single one. The spring cluster began with the Passover lamb. The rules were strict. The animal had to be inspected for 4 days to ensure it was flawless, and during the sacrifice, not a single bone could be broken. Centuries later, Jesus arrived in Jerusalem on the exact day those lambs were selected. He was questioned by authorities for 4 days, and Pilate eventually declared he could find no fault in him. He died on the cross at the same hour the Passover lambs were being slaughtered, with his bones remaining unbroken. The next day, the Feast of Unleavened Bread required Israelites to sweep all yeast, a symbol for corruption, out of their homes. This coincided precisely with the burial of Jesus, whose sinless body was placed in the earth, free from decay. Then came the appointment of Firstfruits. A farmer would cut the very first bundle of barley to sprout and wave it before the Lord on a Sunday. This humble sheaf was a guarantee that a larger, full harvest was coming. On that exact Sunday morning, Jesus rose from the dead. He became the firstfruits of the resurrection, the first singular life emerging from the grave, as a guarantee that many more would follow. The spring cluster shows a perfect attendance record. God kept these historical appointments down to the exact day and the exact hour. 50 days after firstfruits, the calendar moves to Pentecost, or Shavuot. This day was an anomaly. While most offerings forbade yeast, this one required 2 loaves of bread baked with leaven to represent imperfect, sinful people being brought to God. On the original Pentecost at Mount Sinai, God descended on the mountain in fire. The mountain trembled, the people were terrified of the external law written on stone, and 3,000 people died in the judgment that followed. But during the fulfillment in the New Testament, the fire didn't land on a mountain, it rested on people. The Spirit wrote the law on human hearts instead of stone, and this time, 3,000 people were given life. This single calendar date acted as a hinge for history. It showed that the internal spirit could accomplish the restoration that the external law, weakened by human failure, could not. Following the events of Pentecost, the calendar goes quiet. There are no appointments for 4 months, stretching through the late spring and the entire summer. Historically, this was the peak of the agricultural season. Workers were in the fields from sunrise to sunset, laboring to gather the wheat and grapes before the fall rains arrived. There was no time for festivals, only the work of the harvest. Because the spring and summer appointments were fulfilled by the first coming of Christ and the arrival of the Spirit, but the fall dates remain unfulfilled, the logic of the calendar places us in this specific gap. We are living in the middle of that 4-month working season. This means our current era is a season of gathering. The harvest is ripening, and every person who responds to the gospel is another sheaf brought in before the deadline of the fall rains. That summer silence will eventually be broken by the 5th appointment, the Feast of Trumpets. In ancient Israel, the blast of the shofar was an alarm. a shout of urgency signaling that a king was arriving and the people needed to assemble immediately. Next is the Day of Atonement, a day of national accounting. Historically, a scapegoat was used to carry the weight of a year's worth of failures into a desolate wilderness, physically removing the stain of sin from the community so it could never return. The final appointment is the Feast of Tabernacles, where families leave their homes to live in booths called Sukkot. These shelters are deliberately fragile, with thin walls and open roofs that allow you to see the stars. The booth represents the reality of human life. It is a temporary pilgrimage in a wilderness where you are completely dependent on God for protection because your own walls are too thin to save you. This leads to the final fulfillment. The calendar suggests that the God who once lived in a temporary human body, a fragile booth that could bleed and die, will eventually establish a permanent dwelling place among his people. The God who kept 4 spring appointments to the exact day is currently managing the timeline of the universe and your life. He has never been early, he has never been late,